Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw an elephant herd in graphite. Now this elephant family is consisting of 5 different elephants and each of those is a slightly different size. So this is going to require a range of techniques in order to get the effect for each elephant right. Now before we get onto that, the first thing I wanted to work on here was the background. Now there are a couple of things to bear in mind when working with landscapes or scenic backgrounds like this, and the first thing is the values and contrast. Now if we're trying to create the impression that that background is further in the distance, then there are a couple of things here that are really important. The first is that it should be a little bit more out of focus to make it look like it is further away from the main subject, and the other is that we need to get the values of the graphite correct. Now the further in the distance something is, the lighter it is going to be. So if there's anything that is too dark, it's actually going to make it look like it's closer to the camera. So this is something that is really important in combination with how out of focus that pencil or that graphite should be. Now as I continue to build up my darker values here, this section of the background is more for the middle part of that scenery. I'm in a moment going to come back in with a lighter section behind this, and that's going to make it look like it's closer to the horizon. So this therefore is further in the distance than the tree line in the middle. Having all of this in here is giving a real sense of depth already, but that's going to only get better when we start working on the elephants in the foreground. Now for all of this background so far, I've only used graphite powder. There's no graphite pencils at all, and that is something here that I really wanted to make sure that I've captured, because I want it to be soft and with that out of focus effect as I've already mentioned. If I use my graphite pencils here, I am going to hint at more detail than I want, so I'm going to use the graphite powder to really simplify that process. Now I do always like to work on the backgrounds first because they are behind the main subject, so it just helps to bring more of that three-dimensional feel to the drawing. Now although I've put a light layer of graphite all the way down to the lower edge, I'm going to leave the grass that's in the foreground until the last element because that's in front of the elephants. Now onto the first elephant, and the use of shading techniques is going to be really important throughout this entire project. I want to be using my pencils to achieve the bulk of that shading, but I'm also going to use a paper blending stump as well to achieve a little bit more softness. Now the first thing here that's really important to remember is that we are drawing the entire body of each of these elephants, so we don't want to be forcing too much detail here within the skin. I want to hint at that detail and give the impression of all of those wrinkles without actually having to draw them. Now the use of the shading and values is what's going to help with that accuracy and three-dimensional look of the portrait, even though there's not going to be a ton of detail. It's all about creating the impression of that detail here. Now if I am to force too much detail, I will actually make this drawing look fake rather than more of that realistic look, which sounds a little bit strange considering the details usually are what help to increase that realism. But it's all about focusing on the use of contrast and values when you're working on drawing the entire subject on a portrait of this size. So if I was working on a much larger scale, then I would be able to get more detail here. But I wanted to keep something where I could focus more on the importance of shading and contrast to show that it's not about drawing all of the tiny intricate details that makes a drawing look realistic. It's the use of contrast and values that does that more so. Now if you're working on a larger scale because you want to include more of the detail within the wrinkles, then of course that's absolutely fine. But you would have to do something that was massive in order to get that level of detail with each of these elephants included. And really the best way to visualize it is compare how big this elephant is to the size of my hand. It's actually very small, but I have included just enough amount of that detail to hint at the wrinkles, to hint at the creases in the skin, because I've got the shading, values and contrast right. Now the one thing here with contrast is you can see that it's built up in stages. It's not something that's achieved with just 1 or 2 layers. I start off with a base foundation with my graphite powder just like the background, and then I start to incorporate the use of the pencils where I'm gradually starting to darken elements and then go in with my erasers to pull in my highlights. Now I really want to be making sure to capture the softness within the lights and the darks. This is something that the real-time tutorial of this entire project focuses on. If I can capture the softness between where the main darker shadows are and those highlights and make sure that it rolls over from one to the other, I'm able to capture more of the rounded shape of the body. This is going to really help to capture the realism for this size drawing. Now this is only 6 inches high by 14 inches long, so this is actually quite narrow, and I wanted to make sure that I could still, as I said, capture that photorealistic look. And the one thing that can really help us to refine all of our basic and the fundamental techniques that are required for the more complex subjects is to work on something that is more scaled down. Even smaller studies, something like this is a great project to work on before jumping into a more complex close-up of an elephant, for example. Now, with all that in mind, this elephant here, the baby elephant, is a prime example. This is tiny. It's only about an inch, inch and a half wide. So this is something here where we're going to have to really focus on that pencil technique. There is no real detail here. It's all about shading. Now, as I start to build up the shape of the face, that's all achieved by making sure that the lights and darks are in the right place. I want to be making sure that I've got that accurate, because if the lights and darks are shifted slightly, then that's enough to change the shape of the face, the body, whatever it may be. The proportions and perspective can really be affected. Now, one thing that you'll notice throughout this entire drawing process and any of my other lessons here on YouTube is the fact that I like to work in small sections. Not only will I work on one elephant at a time, but I will do the face first. I'll then work on one of the legs, the body, the tail. It's something where I find it gets far easier to tackle if it's very small sections. Being that there are 5 elephants on this drawing, it can become quite overwhelming, especially if we're looking at drawing all of the first base layer, the second layer, the third layer and so on, all at the same time for all elephants. I think that would potentially make it far more confusing. We could end up looking at that reference photo and hesitating, not quite sure where we should be or what we should be drawing next. If that is a feeling that you experience throughout the drawing process, it is usually caused by us focusing on too much of a larger area. It's really worth trying to scale that down. Now, even though one section here of the leg might be only 1 or 2 centimeters, I still want to follow that lighting. Any areas where it's in shadow and there is a slight highlight, I really want to be making sure to capture that. Now, this is really something that I focus thoroughly in the real-time version of this lesson, because the way that the lights and darks are captured here, however subtle they are, it really helps to enhance that 3-dimensional shape of the entire drawing. It's almost like I wanted to make it feel like I was watching these elephants walk past me, and being able to create that impression, it really does fall down to the importance of contrast. Now, I've already mentioned about the placement of the highlights and shadows, but on the legs here where the elephants are moving, any motion of a subject needs to be captured correctly, and that really does fall down to where we place the highlights and shadows. The highlights and shadows are not random, just like the wrinkle direction, fur direction, feather direction, whatever it may be. The placement of those lights and darks, it's all following that structure under the skin. So I want to be making sure that if there is a slight shadow or a highlight, I do try to replicate that. Now, when working on this size, it might only be something that is 1 millimeter or 2 wide, something that's a slight indication of that transitional change. But I want to be making sure that I can capture that because it will help with the overall feel and depth of the drawing. Now, something else here that starts to become more noticeable is the elephants on the right hand side are a little bit darker than those on the left side. Now, as each of these elephants, it's overlapping. So you've got one elephant that's in front. This one here that I'm currently drawing is in between the 3rd elephant and the 5th elephant. So this here is going to be casting a shadow in a couple of different ways, which will make this elephant darker than the others. So being able to notice the variation in lights and darks can help with that depth. It makes it look like that elephant is positioned in the right way. If this elephant was made too light, not only would it look 2-dimensional and flat, but it would give the impression that it's more up close towards the camera where it's not having any shadows cast onto it. So it really does have a knock-on effect. Now, as I've got more of these elephants drawn in, you can see that I haven't paid any attention to the feet. This was deliberate. Because the grasses in the foreground are longer, it's covering the lower part of that foot. There was no need for me to finish that, for me to then erase it with those details. But what I have done is made sure to soften that lower part of the leg and almost make it look like it fades out. This is going to make it easier when you are overlapping any kinds of grasses over the top. If you have any harsh edges or you've put more pressure on those pencils, it's going to make it harder for your erasers to remove. So when you do feel like you're going to be pulling in those lighter grasses over the top with your erasers, it's always worth making sure you're paying very close attention to how much pressure you're applying to the pencil. Now again, the pressure to the pencil is something that I talk about in the real-time tutorials because this is crucial with how many layers we're going to be able to add on top. If you use too much pressure on the pencil early on, that's known as burnishing, and that's where you're flattening the tooth of the paper. Now in some cases you want to do that depending on the effect you're trying to create, but when you're wanting to add multiple layers as I am here, the amount of pressure to apply can really have that impact and a negative impact on what layers can be added on top. And it will also affect how the erasers work. So if the graphite has been applied in the wrong way or too much pressure has been applied, then those erasers are going to have a much harder job to remove that graphite from the surface. One of my favourite erasers is the Tombow Mono Eraser, and that works beautifully as long as the graphite has been applied correctly. If the graphite has been forced into that paper, then the Tombow Mono Eraser is going to have a much harder job to lift that graphite. It's not necessarily an issue with the eraser, it could be partly down to the technique that you're using, but it's usually because the graphite has been applied in the wrong way. And as always, I like to spend the last few minutes where I'm refining my contrast. I'm just coming in here with my darker pencils, making sure that I've got those shadows as dark as they need to be. That's going to help make those lighter values appear lighter. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to this or any of my other real-time step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. As always, if you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video in the next few days, but as always, thank you so much for watching.